Well, that's
So
cool.
yeah,
It's funny because, Ray, of course, went to the first Comic
yeah,
Con in San Diego, and it was very modest and small. It was at the El Cortez Hotel in San
yeah,
Diego. So I think these things tend to start very DIY, very grassroots, very small, like you're doing, and they grow exponentially.
yeah, yeah. Why don't we
It's
go ahead and get started? So just
Please, yeah.
so how long have you been a fan of Ray Bradbury's?
Well, thanks for doing this and celebrating Ray.
Yeah.
As I tell everybody, I said it in the foreword of my first book. I encountered Bradbury in utero, um, and Ray loved that. He thought it sounded like a Ray Bradbury story. My dad read Bradbury to my mom aloud. He read the Illustrated Man aloud to her when she was pregnant with me. And all these years later, I become his biographer, and I've done 4 books, a graphic novel, and worked with him for 12 years. So uh, I don't know what happened in the womb, but something occurred. I obviously heard something because I met him in 2000. I was writing for the Chicago Tribune and interviewed him for a cover story for their magazine on the occasion of his 80th birthday. It was kind of a natural time to interview him. Of course, he was born right in Waukegan on August 22nd, 1920. And so I interviewed him in his home in LA. And he had just suffered a pretty severe stroke. He'd lost 67 pounds. He'd lost a lot of his motor skills, but his mind was still so active and so full of ideas and enthusiasm. And that interview went on all day. He just kept asking me to stay. And by the very end of the day, he said, "You have to do me a favor." And I said, "What is that, Mr. Bradbury?" "Of course." He said, "I want you to come back." And that just stunned me. Someone
Yeah.
I literally met before I was born and read throughout my entire childhood. And the person who most notably made me want to become a writer myself wanted me to return back and visit him. And so I did that. And every few months, I would fly out to Los Angeles where he lived, and we'd have lunch, or he'd take me to one of his plays. He produced a lot of plays, and we struck up this friendship that just continued to unfold and um, become more profound. And that led to all these books.
Great, great. Yeah. Very familiar. And you've written, of course, the biography of Bradbury. What is it? October.
The Bradbury
The
Chronicles.
Bradbury Chronicles. Yes,
Yeah,
I've
so
read
there's
that.
that one. That
Yeah,
came out in 2005.
yeah. I always tell
Um,
everybody if you want everything you need to know about Bradbury's in that book. It's very well written and very fun to read. I found a lot of interesting stuff about him. So
Yeah, I know you've spoken to John Eller, and John has
yeah,
done 3 books on Ray, and they're phenomenal. I mean, they are exhaustive and they're definitive and they're very scholarly. And what I set out to do was something entirely different from what John did, and that was to bring a scholarly approach to Ray, but try to appeal to more of a mainstream audience to make it very readable to the everyday person who might not know a lot about Ray Bradbury, but might
yeah,
just have a tangential interest in him. So
yeah,
that was
yeah.
that was the first book, and then I did a book of interviews with him that I'm very proud of called "Listen to the Echoes."
Yeah, yeah, those are really fun. Because Bradbury's a fascinating. I'm sure I don't have to tell you a fascinating guy to interview because he just meanders into so many fascinating categories and just all the people he met. I joke he's kind of like Forrest Gump. He just happens to have met all these like fascinating people. So yeah,
To that end, Forrest Gump is a great example. I also think that there's almost a Kevin Bacon 7 degrees of separation thing with Ray, but
yeah,
generally you can do it in 2 degrees. Like you say Walt Disney, well, Ray Bradbury knew him. You say
yeah,
George Burns, well, Ray Bradbury knew him. In fact, once I was telling Margaret Atwood that, and we were at Comic-Con together in 2015, and I'm telling her my theory of Bradbury and Kevin Bacon, and Margaret Atwood laughs and she says, "Well, I think Kevin Bacon has you beat." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Look," and he was right in front of us. Because you're at Comic-Con,
sure,
which is
sure,
totally weird. But yeah, all roads lead to Bradbury. I mean, you could
yeah,
throw out anything and they all sort of somehow come back.
yeah, yeah. He worked in all kinds of genres. So let's see. I think you can't. So yes, kind of my second question about how you came to meet him. So, oh, something I've asked a lot of people. You spent a lot of time at his house in Savoy Hills, right, in LA.
Yeah.
So, what was the house like? Was it kind of the way it looked on TV with all the toys and comics everywhere, or?
Well, the TV, if you're talking about the Ray Bradbury Theater, a lot of that was shot both in his office which was not in the house. He had a basement office,
Yeah.
but the intro to that show was shot in a separate office, and also a studio office that wasn't even
Yeah.
actually his. But yes, it did look like that. I mean, he was the original hoarder. The man threw out nothing. I remember once I opened his desk drawer and there were rubber band ringlets in there that children wear on their braces. And I pulled them out, and everything was in there. Movie stubs from the 1930s, check stubs from the 50s. I mean, it was just crazy. And I pulled out these rubber band ringlets from braces, and I brought them upstairs to him and said, "What are these?" And he grabbed them from me and he started to cry. And he held the rubber band to his heart. And I said, "What's wrong? Why are you crying?" And he said, "Those are my daughter Ramona's when she was 15, and you've brought her childhood back to me. Thank you for discovering these." He was deeply sentimental and deeply nostalgic, and yeah, his house looked like that. It was built in, I believe, 37 or 38. It was originally owned by a pretty famous psychiatrist, but when Ray bought it in the late 1950s, they discovered a bunch of whiskey bottles down in the cellar. There's a crawl space down there. So evidently even the psychiatrist, who was renowned, was hiding his whiskey bottles down in the cellar. There's this crawl space loaded with a bunch of empty whiskey bottles. But that house was incredible. I mean, it's exactly like you're saying. I mean, it was packed to the gills, to the rafters, with everything you could possibly think of. He saved it all.
Great. Yeah, he was a very, I believe his wife said the phone book could make him cry. He was a very sentimental guy. So, yeah. And so something about Bradbury, he always classified himself as a fantasy writer. People always referred to him as a science fiction writer, but he always thought of himself as a fantasy writer. Like, why do you think the distinction was important to him?
I think the distinction, that's a great question. The distinction was important to him, number one, because he never really wanted to be labeled at all. His heroes were John Steinbeck and Ernest Hemingway and literary writers. He grew up reading Poe and H.G. Wells and Edgar Rice Burroughs and watching fantastic cinema, fantasy cinema, if you will. But I think he learned a lot from studying the literary masters, and he always thought, why is George Orwell's 1984 not categorized as a work of science fiction? It's categorized as literature. So I think he really bristled by these sort of genre classifications. He looked at them as an offshoot of book publishing marketing. They need to place it somewhere in the bookstore. And I don't think he wanted to just strictly be pigeonholed as one thing. But to your excellent point, I think if you were to ask him and press upon him, well, what category do you put yourself in? First, he would answer you, I'm a teller of tales. He always maintained he was a storyteller. But he said, if you're going to classify me and put me in a section of a bookstore, put me in the fantasy section, to your excellent point. And the reason is that he considered science fiction to be, as he said, the art of the possible. Science fiction is looking ahead to something that could well transpire. We're predicting the future. And he considered Fahrenheit 451 then to be really his only book that could be classified as a work of science fiction. Other critics argue that, of course, well, the Martian Chronicles, we're on another planet with rocket ships and we're colonizing Mars. And he said, no, but it's a work of fantasy because it's completely impossible. There's an atmosphere, the hills are blue, the Martians are there. And so it's a work of fantasy. So he always said science fiction is the art of the possible. Fantasy is the art of the impossible. And so he said, if you're going to categorize me, put me in the fantasy section.
Okay, cool. And do you have any favorite stories or anecdotes about Bradbury? I mean, I know you've got a million of them, but anything that comes to mind?
That's such a tough question. I mean, if I could give you two, I mean, one would be very personal, and that is late in his life when he was mostly homebound and his mind was still as active as ever, but his body was very much withering, and he couldn't leave his house much at all. Maybe twice a year he left the last 2 years of his life. And I would go over late at night, and the patio door, his bedroom had a door that led out to a patio, and you could hear the eucalyptus trees rustling in the wind and the crickets out in the night. And the distant sound of Los Angeles traffic far away. And he didn't live, maybe a mile or two from the ocean, so it was always breezy. And we would sit in that room with that patio door open, and he'd have me bring a bottle of wine over and pour him a glass of wine, and he would sit there. And one night we watched The Wizard of Oz. To sit and watch The Wizard of Oz with Ray Bradbury, it really doesn't get any better than that. And then to look over at him and he's crying. He's crying at the film. He's probably seen it 200 times. So that would be one very personal moment with him. I think probably the next most impactful moment for me was he was given the Medal of Arts from the President of the United States in November of 2004. And he only invited his daughters, his personal assistant, Patrick Kaczurka, who was also his driver, and he invited me. And to walk into the White House with Ray Bradbury and to walk into the Oval Office and meet the president and the first lady, and to see their reaction to meeting Ray Bradbury. They were overwhelmed. That was just that's an experience I'll never get to have ever again in my lifetime, and I'll never forget it.
And that was President Bush and Laura Bush, right? Yeah.
Yeah, a real testament to them, regardless of where you fit, ideologically on the political spectrum. Laura Bush immediately recited a passage from Dandelion Wine to Ray verbatim. She didn't read it. She recited a passage to him verbatim. And he said, "My God, how did you do that?" And she said, "Mr. Bradbury, I'm a librarian." She was, of course, a librarian. And then from that point forward, George Bush pushed Ray Bradbury through the White House and toured him personally, pushed the wheelchair.
Oh, wow.
And I think that's a pretty miraculous statement for an individual, Republican, Democrat, what have you. I can't really say our personal occupant of the White House would push Ray Bradbury around.
Probably not.
I probably shouldn't go there.
So, yeah. Well, that's really neat.
Yeah.
Why don't we talk a little bit more about that book of yours? Why don't you grab that bad boy off the shelf and just explain to us what it is?
Thanks for bringing that up, Orty. So this is my new book of short stories, Dark Black, which the inspiration very much for this book was Ray Bradbury's 1955 classic, The October Country.
Sure.
And October Country actually was a reprinting and a rewriting of his first book, Dark Carnival. Dark Carnival was Ray's first book of Gothic horror. It came out in April of 1947. I mean, I even went so far as to have this book printed in the exact same typeset as Dark Carnival. I mean, the detail in here is we put a lot of tender loving care. Every story is illustrated by, I think, arguably Chicago's greatest illustrator and printmaker, Dan Jetza, has done an illustration for each story. That was very much inspired by what Bradbury did in the October Country with his own illustrator, Joseph Mignani. So the stories in here, there's ghost stories, but there's also stories of just people who are haunted by their past, haunted by their failures. I really prescribe to the narrative notion that you don't need a ghost to be haunted. And so the book really explores 20 different sort of Gothic tales, and it just was released September 22nd. We intentionally worked very hard to get this out as part of Bradbury's Centennial. I think if anybody is interested in getting it, the best place to get it quickly is directly through the publisher. Independent publishing does not make a lot of money through Amazon.com. So if you go to hatandbeard.com, hatandbeard.com, you can order the book directly. You'll get it within a week. It's a gorgeous hardcover that we worked really hard on, and super, super proud of it. It's getting great reviews. And thank you for taking the time to let me talk about it.
So hat isn't a hat I'm wearing, and a beard like what's on your face, hat and beard?
Exactly. Hatandbeard.com.
Okay. Is there a link to it from your website?
There is. If you go to my website, you'll see it right there. I'm at samweller.net. And anybody can always follow me on Twitter. I'm at Sam__Weller on Twitter. And I tweet often about Bradbury. I go into my files and tweet letters and photographs I find and stories. And it's a very important way for me to continue to keep his legacy going on a daily basis, is using social media.
Okay. Great. Well, that sounds really cool, and I'm totally going to buy a copy of that. And I highly recommend your books about Bradbury. Listen to The Echoes and the Bradbury Chronicles. They're very fun and they're very readable. Anybody who has an interest in Bradbury would learn a lot. I learned a lot. So
Thank you,
yeah,
Wauke.
great. Well, thank
Hey,
you very much. Well, I will send you this probably vis-a-vis Dropbox has really worked out well for this. And I'll also post it on the site. So thank you very much for taking the time. I know you've got a million things going on and we'll totally be in touch.
hey, good luck with Wauke-Con, and when it's open in person and it's not virtual, I'll be there, first one in line.
All right, totally. Thank you
Thanks,
so
man.
much. Have a good
Thank you.
day.
You
Yeah,
too. Bye.
bye.